What's up guys, I'm here with the pokerweasel.com calculator sheet. This really makes it easy to run all of the important calculations that we need when running poker analysis. So just as a quick overview, we can see we have required fold equity calculator, basic EV calculator, so that just takes into account win amount, loss amount, current pot, etc. and calculates that EV. Advanced EV calculator, which takes into account fold equity, so that's essentially EV of a semi-bluff. Combo counter, fold equity calculator, combined fold equity, so if you want to know how much cumulative folds we get. So if player 1 folds 70 and player 2 folds 80, what's our total expected fold equity? Calculating pot size raises, setting the stack to pot ratio. Very often our pre-flop sizing should be designed around setting up the desired post-flop SPR. The sheet's going to help us do that. Required equity pre-flop. In other words, this is a pot odds calculator. Pot odds calculation for post-flop as well, required equity post-flop. Odds and outs, our likelihood of hitting certain types of hands, whether we are going from flop to river, turn to river, etc. Possibility of an overcard hitting, depending on what our street requirements are, whether it's pre-flop to flop, pre-flop to turn, etc. So let's say we have top pair on the flop. How likely is it that an overcard is going to come on the turn? Of course, that depends on how many possible overcards there are. If there's only one possible overcard, it's not going to be as likely. If there were 5 possible overcards, it's going to be more likely that one of them hits by the next street. Setting up stack for the next street. But then we move on to some slightly more complex chunking maths over on the right hand side of the sheet. So we have setting up stack for the next street. We also have 2 or 3 street plans. Sometimes it's useful to know what percentage of the pot we need to bet on each street if we want to get the stacks in smoothly, betting the same percentage of the pot on every betting round. Finally, we have the sizing finder. So this allows us to select the highest EV option between 2 different lines, where we can use a range of different bet sizings for either of those lines. So we have line number 1 and all the sizings that we can use, and their relative expectation depending on the success frequency of a bluff. Then we have the option to compare that to an alternate line and compare the EV by factoring in how often that alternate opportunity is given, assuming the first opportunity is not taken. So to give an example, it could be something such as, do we fire a float bet on the turn, or do we go for a delayed turn float bet on the river? So we might often get more fold equity with the delayed turn float bet on the river, but some of the time our opponent's going to lead the river and deny us of the opportunity of going for that delayed turn float bet. So unless we take the initial opportunity to float bet the turn, which will occur at 100%, then in order to calculate the EV of the alternate line, we need to downweight it based on how often we actually get that opportunity. We'll discuss this more in the individual tutorial for using each of these 2 tabs. Now let's move on to the rate comparison. This particular area of the game is highly overlooked. Players honestly just jump into games having absolutely no idea how much rate they're paying for the privilege of operating on a certain room. This allows us to dispel the confusion here and understand exactly how much we are paying to play in certain rooms and whether it's worth it. And you'll often find that you can't just compare 2 rooms directly. We have to compare individual limits. Sometimes a room might be okay in general, but for specific limits, they hugely underperform in terms of price compared to other rooms. Obviously, our goal is to pay as little rake as possible, although it is a trade-off sometimes. Sometimes the softer rooms just so happen to charge more rake, which is what dissuades the regs from playing there, which is what results in the soft games in the end. So how do we use this sheet? At the moment, we can just see it's an empty sheet. So what do we do with this? Well, we follow this link to the rate sheet with the current number. So this is going to be kept up to date with the different numbers for the different rooms. So let's follow that link right now. So we can see the rate data here for PokerStars. We have the rate data for the other rooms here, which is expandable. All we have to do is copy the values from the certain limit. For example, let's say we wanted to get the rate data for 25 Inal stars. And by the way, all of the data is on this sheet, so you don't actually have to copy and paste. You could just refer to this sheet if you wanted to. The idea behind the calculator is it allows us to compare limits. So we can just copy a specific room and specific limit into the sheet and compare it directly to another room and specific limit of our choice. So for example, let's say we wanted to compare 25 NL stars. We just copy these 3 columns, come here and paste them, and the rest of the sheet is going to be calculated automatically. Now let's return to our rake numbers, and let's say we want to compare that to 25 NL on party, because we're interested in what the difference is. We're going to copy and paste that. So now we can see the numbers side by side, rather than having to try and reference 2 parts of a sheet which are a long way from each other. We can just compare them side by side. So now we get an idea of what the differences are between playing L25 on the 2 rims. We won't talk directly about what all of the numbers mean right now. We'll have a look at those in the individual tutorial. But essentially, one of the mistakes players make is they just try and compare the cap and the rake percentages directly. And rake's generally more complex than that. The rake and the cap interact in different ways for different pot sizes. So you might find, for example, that one room is relatively cheap to play small pots, but relatively expensive to play large pots, and vice versa. So it's important to compare rake values for a range of different stack sizes, and that's exactly what we've done here. So more will be explained in the individual tutorial, but I'm sure you get the general gist of what this sheet is designed to do. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Remember, you can pick up your copy of the PokerWeasel.com calculator at www.pokerweasel.com.